Chapter 1 Who Goes Next? True Stories of Exciting Escapes. No mortal thing can deter me. In 1743, Baron Frederick von der Trenck, a 17-year-old subaltern in Frederick the Great's royal bodyguard, was conducted to Colonel Jaschinski's quarters and informed that he was to be imprisoned in the fortress of Glatz in Silesia. Young Trenck was staggered. He had committed no crime, was not guilty of any military misconduct. "But for what reason, sir?" he demanded. "Whatever the reason," the colonel snapped, "it is not my business. Guards, remove the prisoner." "But I have not been accused, or tried, or judged," Trenck cried. "The king has already taken care of all that," the colonel said. "You are to be stripped of your rank and conducted to Glatz immediately." His voice held a heavy note of finality. There was no accusation, no court of inquiry, not even a sentence. In a state of total bewilderment, young Trenck was cashiered from the Prussian army and placed in prison. It was all done by the king's command. Frederick the Great was an unbalanced egomaniac, and he had taken an unreasoning dislike to the young baron simply because his sister had been charmed by Trenck's personality. He had Trenck incarcerated on a trumped-up charge of treason that was absolutely absurd. But by the king's word was law, and Trenck could make no appeal for justice. Trenck therefore resolved to win his freedom by his own wits. "I'm innocent," he told the governor of Glatz. "I have never been tried and should not be in prison. I shall do everything in my power to regain my liberty. I shall persist in trying to escape until I either succeed or lose my life in the attempt." He meant what he said. In the next 3 years, Baron Trenck attempted 5 escapes. In one dramatic attempt, he procured a penknife, notched the blade, and sawed through 8 iron bars on his cell window. Then he sliced his leather portmanteau into thongs, sewed them end to end, added the sheets from his bed, and climbed down the face of the citadel's tower, 90 feet, by way of this chancy rope. It was raining, the night was dark, and everything seemed ideal for his purpose, except that the moat was knee-deep in gluey mud. Trenck fought the morass for hours, but was not able to extricate himself. Realizing his position was hopeless, he gave up at dawn and shouted for the astonished sentry, calling, "Go inform the governor that Trenck is stuck fast in the moat." Another hair-raising attempt was made when 3 officers came to Trenck's cell one day to examine every corner of his room. A major started a tirade against Trenck, claiming that the young baron had committed a second crime by endeavoring to escape. There was no plan in Trenck's mind when he suddenly went into action. He simply saw his chance and he took it. He snatched the major's sword from its scabbard, sprang through the open door, tumbled the sentry outside the cell down the staircase, and started running through the corridors. He ran right into a large group of soldiers who had come to relieve the guard. Trenck caught them by surprise and hacked his way through, wounding 4 of them. Darting through an archway, he gained the ramparts, and without hesitation, sword in hand, leaped over the parapet and dropped into the yard below without hurting himself. None of the guards had the courage to leap after him, and for a vivid moment it looked as though Trenck would reach the palisade and make good his escape. He encountered a sentry in a narrow passage and parried the man's bayonet and wounded him in the face. Instantly a second sentry ran from the outworks to grab him from behind, and Trenck made a desperate spring at the palisade. His foot caught, a bayonet sliced his lip. He was surrounded and beaten with musket butts and dragged back to prison, struggling and defending himself like a madman. Trenck's 5th attempt at freedom occurred in 1746 when he made friends with a Lieutenant Schell of the Guards. Schell himself was in bad with the governor, and when a friend warned him that he was going to be relieved from duty and placed under arrest, Schell snatched up a saber and hurried to Trenck's cell. "I'm in trouble," he whispered. "Let's make a bolt for it together. But one thing, don't let them take me alive." They walked out of the cell, and Schell said to the sentry, "I'm taking the prisoner to the anteroom. Stand where you are." Once in the anteroom, they passed out by another door and gained the outer ramparts. They walked right into the two officers who were coming to arrest Shell. Shell sprang to the parapet and went over the wall, which was not very high at that spot, and Trenck jumped after him. Trenck landed unhurt, but Shell had twisted his ankle. They still had the palisade to leap, and Shell couldn't walk. He drew his saber and handed it to Trenck. "Kill me and run for it." Trenck refused to comply. Instead, he picked up Shell and dropped him over the palisade, jumped over himself, and then, carrying his crippled friend on his back, ran into the twilight fog. The alarm guns were fired before they had gone 100 yards. "It's hopeless," Shell said despairingly. "We'll never make it like this. You're simply laboring in vain." Trenck refused to listen. "Death or freedom," he gasped. "I've made up my mind to that." The alarm had now sounded in the surrounding villages, and all the garrison troops, as well as hundreds of peasants, came out to help in forming the encircling ring. Trenck struggled down to the river Neisse and started wading. It was December, and there was ice in the river. Trenck waded through the freezing water until the bottom dropped beneath his feet. Then he had Shell cling to his neck, and he started to swim. He found bottom again within 6 yards, and they reached the other bank. Day found them on the road to Silesia. They had traveled about 20 miles, having stolen first a rowboat and then 2 horses, and now they were at the frontier and safety. At the town of Branau, Trenck sent the saber and 2 horses back to the governor of Glatz with a mocking letter. Only the day before, the governor had publicly stated that it was quite impossible for Baron Trenck to escape. Frederick the Great was not a forgiving man. For 8 years, while Trenck roamed Europe as a soldier of fortune, the Prussian king plotted his vengeance. His opportunity came in 1754. Trenck's mother had died in Danzig, and he went there to settle her estate. Danzig was a free town at that time, but Trenck had hardly entered the city gate when Frederick's agents pounced on him. He was taken to the Star Fort at Magdeburg and placed in a cell that Frederick had already prepared for him. It was in a casemate 6 feet by 10 feet, and there were 3 doors between his cell and the corridor. The walls were 7 feet thick, and there were iron bars within and without his single window. His food allowance was 1.5 pounds of bread per day and a jug of water. "You will never escape this prison, Baron," the governor said. "No mortal thing can deter me from attempting to obtain my freedom," Trenck answered. The 3 doors were kept perpetually locked, except for 1 day a week, when the governor came to inspect Trenck and his cell. Trenck received his pittance of bread and water through an aperture in the wall. This arrangement gave him an excellent opportunity to work out a plan of escape without being observed. His cell contained a stool which was secured to the floor by iron strips 18 inches long. Laboring night and day, he was able to work loose one of those strap irons. Now he had a tool. He went to work on the wall. The first layer was brick, and behind that there were large hewn stones. It was tedious labor, and it necessitated intricate planning. Each brick and stone had to be numbered so that it could be set back in place before the governor made his weekly visit. This included the outer mortar. The wall had been whitewashed, and in order to fill in the chinks he flaked off and pounded up some of the whitewash, wetted it, made a brush of his own hair, and applied this plaster to the chinks to make the wall appear uniform. Then he sat with his naked back against the place and dried it with his body heat. It was impossible to replace all of the mortar and brick and stone chips, so he scattered the residue on the floor and ground it to dust underfoot. Placing this dust in the aperture of his window, he made a sort of broom by tying splinters of his bedstead together with the unraveled yarn of his stocking, and affixed tufts of his hair to one end of it. Then he brushed the dust as far as he could through the aperture and let the night wind blow it away. The labor of penetrating through the 7-foot wall was incredible. The fort was an ancient pile, and much of the mortar had petrified, which often forced Trenck to reduce a whole stone to dust. It took him 6 long months to reach the outer facing of brick. Freedom was only inches away. Then disaster struck. Trenck had just replaced all the stones in his tunnel and camouflaged the entrance when a group of officers walked in. "Gather up your bedding, Baron," one of them said. "We are taking you to a new cell." 6 torturous months of unremitting labor for nothing. Trenck's new dungeon was built in the ditch of the Star Fort. The stone walls were 6 feet thick, and there were 4 double doors to the corridor. One end of a chain was fixed to his ankle, the other to a ring built in the wall. A huge iron ring was then riveted around his body, to which hung a chain clamped to an iron bar which had a handcuff at each end. Escape seemed impossible, yet Trenck still refused to submit to his unjust fate. In his own words, "I glowed with the desire of convincing the world that I was capable of suffering what man had never suffered before, perhaps of at last emerging from this load of wretchedness and triumphing over my enemies." Gritting his teeth with pain, he forced his hands through the cuffs, the blood spurting from under his fingernails. Setting his back to the wall and making a Herculean effort, he was able to bend open the hook that connected the chain to the ring round his body. Again, with incredible strength, he doubled the ankle chain links and wrenched and strained until one link flew off. The double doors were of oak 2 inches thick. Trenck had concealed his tool in his clothes, and he now went to work gouging out the wood around the lock plate. He knew he only had 24 hours before the guards returned, and he worked frenziedly in the pitch dark, his fingers clotted with his own blood. One door opened, then another. Daylight appeared, the 3rd door was open, and he started on the last. Time was running out. Something went snap, and the broken tool dropped to the ground. He was placed in chains again, and his spirit fell to a low ebb. The conditions in his cell were impossible. He was continually wet to the skin with icy water that dripped on him from the vaulted roof. He fell sick and was incapacitated for months